Greetings, world history students. This is your friendly Professor Alyssa here, dropping in to say hello and kind of review some of the key concepts from this week's readings and viewings and interactions or interactives that you should have completed by now. I just sent out an email as well as I came in here to prepare to go over these concepts because I figured that, by Thursday you've had a chance to review and you've engaged in your discussions. I found out that unfortunately, it does not look like anyone has of yet engaged with our discussion this week. So that's a bit of a challenge for us because you have to keep in mind that a discussion is one in which we engage throughout the week. We are in an asynchronous environment, which means we don't come together twice a week at a set time face to face to converse. So instead, we have these expectations that when we have our discussions, because each week you'll have either a discussion, as you can see here, or you'll have some kind of group exercise where we will, as a group, go to a website and annotate an article. Either way it goes, your initial responses need to be done and completed by Wednesday. And I've put this into our description right here. This is a policy that I've had in place. I overlooked telling you that and mentioning that to you so I can understand why no one has posted as of yet. Thursday by the latest, but it's important that we are coming in and we're engaging and we're showing our participation throughout the week. So you have a requirement to post 3 times, 1 initial response and 2 responses to your fellow classmates. If someone comes in on Wednesday and posts and you're not coming in until Sunday, you're not engaging in that discussion. We don't meet face to face. So you need to be coming into the classroom and showing that you are engaged throughout the week. You have 3 post requirements and you must post on at least 2 additional days. Or 2 different days, one being Wednesday and then another day. Now, if you post on Monday, you could come back in and post on Wednesday if you wanted to. But if you're waiting to post until Saturday and Sunday, you're not going to earn full credit because you're not fully engaging, okay? I don't want to beat a dead horse here. I just want to point that out. Now, the Wednesday requirement for postings will begin in week 3 because I did overlook putting that in here for you. So I do expect that you will post your initial responses by Friday. That will have given you plenty of time to go over our content for this week. And I want to review some of these concepts with you that I think might help. As you can see here, our title for this week is Common Traits in World History. And what we're looking at are these early civilizations and the ways in which people evolved. Let me pull up my PowerPoint for you. Now, you can see here from last week, we talked about this early human diaspora. That is the migration of people to and from places. And the earliest humans began to make their way out of Africa into the Middle East and the Fertile Crescent there, up into the northwest, and then, of course, down into the southeast and then up into the south. The Northeast and across the land barrier into the Americas. And the early people, the way we characterize our early era is called Paleolithic era. This is called the Old Stone Age. Basically, it's all of human evolution and the indications of first like human formations of societies and cultures through the early tools that we see through about 10,000 BCE. Now, before about the 90s, the way in which we looked at time was through the idea of BC and AD, before Christ and after death, a very Western perspective on marking history. And we've transitioned to a more global perspective of using the words BC and BCE. So before the Common Era, and then, BCE for before the Common Era, and then CE, the Common Era. The dates don't change, just the labels so that we're coming from a more global perspective. So this period of time that leads up to about 10,000 BCE shows a lot of vast changes in global movement. We see that people begin to migrate across the entire globe. But the first peoples who begin to migrate, these hunter-gatherers of the Paleolithic era, they migrated largely in small groups, small bands of no more than 40 per group. And if you were to think critically about why that is, right? Why would people who are following their food and they don't have a settled environment, why would they be moving around in small groups? Well, obviously, you can't really move around with much more than about that. And then also, this period is considered a period of relative peacefulness between different groups. And why would that be? Right? Well, again, if we use our critical thinking and think about the fact that we're talking about migratory people who are following their food, then we're not talking about people who have settled down. There's no territorial reason to engage in any kind of confrontation. If you come up against an aggressive group, you can just turn and go the other way, right? And so that's why we believe that this period of time was likely more peaceful. Human development during the Paleolithic era, this is when we see a lot of the physical evolutions in the human body, from going to a stand-up, erect position, a shift in the larynx so that we have the ability to communicate and form speech, which is going to be, fundamental to the creation of culture. Our eyesight's improve. Most of us get less hairy, right? We have changes in the shapes of our brains. We're living in these semi-permanent shelters. We're not advanced enough at this period of time to have like advanced technology. We're using very rudimentary like stone tools and already created natural shelters like caves and lean-tos for protection against the elements. And in those caves, these early peoples, we do see the beginnings of culture because we see the mastering of cave painting. We see again, this use of fire, and then the creation of clothing. So we begin to see the evolution of mankind, or humankind rather. Here is one of those paintings for you. And then human adaptations, we emerge in East Africa. There's two characteristics that distinguish humans, and that's the technical skills and then cultural creativity, the basics of culture. And the basics of culture, when we transition from scavenging to hunting, we begin to create skill sets in the craft of hunting, right? And depending on where we are in the world, if we're in the Americas, the hunting skills that we need are going to be very different for the animals that are there versus what we see in like the Middle East. And so we see these cultural changes occur. Culture is very much tied, especially in these early civilizations, to the environment in which people are evolving. Right? We have these forager societies, and when we are foraging, they're more male dominated because they're hunting. But as we begin to see a shift in gender based upon the settlements, we'll see more of a maternal lineage coming out. We have symbolism, right? The idea of abstract symbolism is considered to be one of the primary characteristics of human function, the ability to create abstract rather than realistic or realism symbols. And then an intellectual modernity, right, is the idea that we see grave sites coming about 9,000 BCE. So we start to see ceremonies and the idea of treatment of people and preparation for them for an afterlife. So we know that these concepts, these understandings of life and death, and something that our consciousness exists at this period of time as well. These sites also show the conception of higher thought, right? Again, that significance of life and death and ancestry and generational continuity. So we're beginning to see the beginning of the spirituality in humans. Now, the Neolithic era or age is distinguished from the Paleolithic era in that people begin this agricultural evolution. They begin to transition from gathering and hunting to domesticating both crops and animals so that people can live in sedentary places. And largely, we believe that this transition from this nomadic world to the settlement world is due to one of the many ice ages and the fact that you can't keep tracking animals that don't exist. You've got to find a way to create a self-sustaining food source for people. And even though we mark that period as occurring around 10,000 BCE, keep in mind that this is a slow process. It's not like your parents were migrating and all of a sudden you're settling down and you're raising pigs and corn, right? It takes several generations for this adaptation to actually occur. But we know there's a lot of effects on humans and on societies, because when we have husbandry of animals and plants, we also see a steady expansion of population. When you have a steady food supply, people can eat more. More people eating means that they're healthy enough to have babies. So if you have more food, that's going to equal more babies. We also see the creation of privately owned property. Before this, like we said, during the nomadic era, there wasn't really that territorial need because there wasn't this idea of land ownership. No one was tied to a specific piece of land, but now they're tied to it. And the idea of private ownership comes up. And if we use our critical thinking, we could probably figure out why, right? There were no prior permanent settlements. But if you have tilled that land, if you have worked it, then you want to protect your interests. And so in society, we see the rise of organized law, right? And law is created as a means to negotiate these new understandings of private ownership of land. So people work land, then they want to have a claim to it. And so then law emerges first as a way of making sense of these relationships. We also have to have enforcement agencies, and that leads to a larger governmental structure. Now you have to have someone who writes the laws, someone who is implementing those laws, and people to enforce those laws. So now we're beginning to see the expansion of government and its functions. We also see, once we have more food, meaning we have more people, we have the beginnings of specialization in labor. There's more people, and so some people can work on farms and other people can be working on other things. If we've got to a place where we're no longer having to worry just about food, we begin to move up that Maslow hierarchical pyramid, right? From basic needs to additional needs. And so specialized skill sets become, tool makers, the cultivators of land, absolutely. But we also see, different types of labor and an enlargement of the role of women in societies. And so largely these early civilizations are matriarchal societies, meaning they're female driven. We only see a patriarchy, a male driven society emerge once these societies begin to engage in war. This here is an early sculpture showing the power of fertility, right? The first food-producing societies tell us a lot about resistance. So, when you begin to cultivate land and you begin to domesticate animals, you're now living in closer proximity to those animals. And so disease is transferred, but then immunity to disease is also something that occurs. So we see a declining in health and lifespans, but we also see after a while a rise in that and new immunities. So the first earliest food-producing societies were thought to have been produced or thought to be established in the Fertile Crescent. Here are all of our first civilizations. You can see they're in Africa, Asia, China, and the Americas as well. Here you see these different places and the kinds of animals that were domesticated by location. I will post this PowerPoint for you shortly as well. We have agrarian and irrigation civilizations, right? When we see these changes like the ice age and people go from migrating, right, to settlement, we see again the population change, we see surpluses in wealth as well, craft and production, and a lot of this need to maintain records, the creation of urban life, new technology, the use of draft animals and irrigation. The characteristics of agrarian civilizations, these are the commonalities that people share, all right? They were primary rural societies. They were based on peasant agriculture and livestock breeding. They allowed people to maintain a life in balance with nature. They had religions that were based heavily on gods and spirits that controlled the natural environment, and their religion emphasized ritual and sacrifice. It's not strange that this would happen, right? Because you think about it, time is cyclical, right? And we have to make sense of it. Now, look at here. The majority of our early civilizations emerge on rivers, right? Even here in Western Africa, it's on the rivers, right? The Niger River. Here in the Fertile Crescent, which is this orange right here, on the Euphrates and Tigris River. Egypt comes up on the Nile, right? The Indus Valley civilizations, that's on the Indus River, the Yellow and the Yangtze River in China. So when we begin to settle down and we're going to start, engaging in agriculture, we need a way to water our crops. So it's not surprising that people begin to organize their societies around these rivers. But keep in mind that these societies largely grow up independent of each other, meaning that those who were in the Yangtze and Yellow River didn't communicate with Egypt, and Egypt didn't communicate with the Indus Valley. This is, a very early period of time, and yet people evolve in the same way because we have much more in common than we have that's different. But it's those cultural differences based upon geography that tends to drive our identities. And that's what leads to this us versus them mentality. And what I mean by that is on the River Nile here, right? The River Nile was very predictable. It flooded predictably every year, and when the floods went down, there were all these nutrients in the ground that made for wonderful agricultural lands. And so when people began to navigate there, it was predictable, it was more peaceful. Now, on the Tigris and Euphrates, it was much more, just erratic. It could flood, it could be, a drought. And so the idea that people have this need to feel empowered over their land leads to a need for people to say, how do we control these natural events? And finally, someone in the group says, oh, I know, there is this man in the sky, or these people in the sky, or this tree in the sky, or whatever, right? And if we appeal to these gods and goddesses, they will help us here, right? They're in charge of this river. We gotta be cool with them. They gotta be cool with us. And if we have that, then we'll have what we need. And those people who began to claim this ability to navigate the relationship between the people and the gods became the religious leaders, right? And this happens all around in all these civilizations. And then what happens? Well, you and I, we want to go talk to this religious leader, right? We need some help. And so, hey, since we're going to be meeting there anyway, why don't I bring my stuff to trade and you can bring your stuff to trade, and then we'll do it right there. So there are markets emerge next to these temples. And hey, if we're going to have a markets here, why don't we just live here? And so we start to see these areas, these city states where you have people living in the city, and then the outside area are where we see the rivers and we see these lands being farmed and crops being grown. And we see this time and time again throughout all of these early civilizations. So it's a really beautiful truth, because again, it speaks to how much we have in common. And so I think that's an important note for today. Now, for this week, and you see, I'll be opening up the River Valley Civilizations, Mesopotamia tomorrow, so you can get a head start on that. But for this week, you've got the Neolithic Revolution, which is going to explain this, shift to the transition to an agricultural land. And in here in the Khan Academy, there's a great presentation, and then there's readings, and then there's some assessments for you. You've got an article that kind of pushes that idea of civilization. Cynthia Brown is going to go over those key characteristics that are common through these early civilizations. Guns, Germs, and Steel is a documentary. It's a little bit older now, maybe 15 years, but the premise that Jared Diamond makes, the author and the academic here, is interesting because it gives you a good visual on what this Neolithic era looked like. I don't agree with everything he says, but he does make some really important points. the archaeology of ancient Egypt, a very brief article, but it does give you a case study example of what this, ancient civilization evolution looked like. Your journal is due by Sunday. The discussion you need to get done by tomorrow. And moving forward, remember that'll be on Wednesday. If you have any questions for me, please let me know. I look forward to speaking with each of you individually. And if you have any questions, text me, email me, call me. Otherwise, until we see each other again, be kind to each other and make good choices.